I'm looking at a Ford service document that most owners never see, and it quietly explains why some EcoBoost turbos don't make it past 80,000 miles. Not explode, not suddenly fail, just slowly wear down until one day the power feels off, the engine sounds different, and you're staring at a repair bill that can easily cross a few $1,000s. And here's the part that caught my attention. Buried in the language is a pattern that points to something surprisingly simple. On paper, EcoBoost engines are a perfect idea. Smaller displacement, turbocharged power, better fuel economy, lower emissions. It's exactly what regulators wanted and exactly what buyers were promised. And to be fair, in a lot of cases they deliver. Smooth torque, good efficiency, solid performance for the size. But there's a gap between how these engines are designed to operate and how they're actually used in the real world. Short trips, stop-and-go traffic, long oil change intervals, inconsistent maintenance. Stack all of that together and certain components start experiencing conditions they weren't exactly optimized for long term. And one of the most sensitive parts in that entire system is the turbocharger. But here's where it starts to get interesting, because the turbo itself isn't really the problem. If your turbo is starting to struggle, it usually doesn't fail all at once. It leaves clues, subtle ones at first. Maybe the engine feels a little less responsive than it used to. Maybe there's a faint whining sound when you accelerate. Some drivers notice a puff of smoke on startup. Others start adding a bit. More oil between changes without thinking much of it. And most people completely miss the early warning sign. The change in how the engine sounds during cold starts. That slightly rough, almost dry-sounding spin before everything smooths out. It's easy to ignore, but it's telling you something important. According to multiple technical service bulletins issued over the years, Ford engineers were already tracking oil-related turbo concerns early on. Not in a dramatic way. No big announcements, no recalls, but in the kind of quiet documentation that technicians rely on. Adjustments to service procedures, updated recommendations, small notes about oil behavior under certain conditions. And to be clear, Ford's reasoning makes sense. Thinner oils like 5W20 or ZW20 improve fuel economy. Longer oil change intervals reduce ownership costs on paper. From an engineering and regulatory standpoint, it all lines up. But here's the thing, those recommendations assume a certain type of driving. And most people don't drive that way. To understand why these turbos struggle, you have to look at one thing most people ignore: oil behavior under heat. A turbocharger spins at extreme speeds. We're talking over 150,000 RPM in some cases. That's not just fast. That's a level of rotational speed where even microscopic imperfections matter. The only thing keeping that spinning shaft from grinding itself apart is a thin film of oil. Not a bearing in the traditional sense, more like a cushion of pressurized liquid. Think of it like this. Imagine a metal rod spinning inside a sleeve, but instead of touching, it's floating on a layer of fluid. As long as that fluid stays consistent, everything works smoothly. But if that layer gets too thin, too hot, or contaminated, metal starts getting closer to metal. And when that happens, wear doesn't just increase, it accelerates. Now layer in real-world conditions. Direct injection engines, like EcoBoost, tend to introduce a small amount of fuel into the oil over time. It's called fuel dilution. In simple terms, your oil slowly becomes less like thick protective syrup, and more like a thinner, less stable liquid. Add heat cycles, especially short trips where the engine doesn't fully warm up consistently, and you get moisture buildup, incomplete burn-off, and faster oil degradation. Then stretch that oil change interval to 7,500 or even 10,000 miles. What you end up with is oil that's technically still within spec, but no longer performing at its best when the turbo needs it most. And this next part is what most dealerships never explain clearly. Oil doesn't just lubricate the turbo, it also cools it. When you shut off a hot engine, the turbo is still extremely hot. Without fresh oil flowing through it, the oil sitting inside can start to break down. Over time, that creates carbon deposits, what mechanics often call coking. Think of it like burnt sugar hardening inside tiny passages. Once that buildup starts, oil flow gets restricted. And when oil flow drops, the turbo shaft isn't floating the way it should anymore. When you actually open one of these failed turbos, the pattern is surprisingly consistent. You'll often see scoring on the shaft, signs of heat stress, and in many cases, carbon buildup around the oil channels. It's not catastrophic damage, it's gradual wear that's been building for thousands of miles. If you looked inside one under a microscope, you'd likely see surfaces that were once smooth now showing fine scratches and discoloration. Not because something suddenly broke, but because lubrication conditions weren't ideal for long enough. And that's what makes this tricky. But here's the part that surprised even experienced mechanics. Many of these issues show up in engines that were maintained exactly according to the factory schedule. Which brings us to the conflict. Ford's official recommendation actually makes sense, at least from an engineering and regulatory standpoint. Thinner oils reduce drag, longer intervals reduce maintenance costs. and under controlled testing conditions, the system performs within expected limits. But real-world driving isn't controlled. It's unpredictable. It's short trips, cold starts, traffic, heat, inconsistent throttle use. So while the system works exactly as designed, it's often operating outside the ideal conditions it was designed for. And that gap, that difference between theory and reality, is where wear starts to creep in. So where does the $3 fix come into this? It's not a magic part. It's not a secret component hidden somewhere in the engine bay. It's something much simpler, and honestly, a bit less dramatic than the title might suggest. It comes down to improving how your oil performs in real-world conditions. In many cases, that $3 fix refers to either using a slightly higher quality oil filter or reducing the oil change interval significantly, sometimes both. Because when oil is refreshed more frequently, it maintains its viscosity, its cooling ability, and its resistance to breakdown. That directly affects how well the turbo is protected. Some mechanics also point to small, inexpensive components like PCV system filters or check valves, parts that help manage pressure and contamination inside the engine. When those are functioning properly, they reduce the amount of unwanted vapor and residue that can mix with the oil. None of these changes guarantee your turbo will last forever, but evidence suggests they can reduce the rate of wear, especially in engines that see harsher driving conditions. And this is the part you can check yourself this week. Pull your dipstick and look at the oil. Not just the level, look at the color, the consistency. Does it seem unusually thin? Does it smell like fuel? Those are small clues. Now, this isn't a one-size-fits-all situation. It depends on how and what you drive. If you're running a higher mileage EcoBoost engine and doing mostly city driving, consider shortening your oil change interval. Not drastically, just enough to keep the oil in a more stable condition. If you're still under warranty, you might want to stay within manufacturer guidelines, but increasing frequency, rather than changing specifications, can still make a difference. If you're doing mostly highway miles, steady speeds, longer trips, the factory recommendations are generally more aligned with that type of use. And if you've ever noticed that slight turbo whine getting louder over time, or you're adding oil more often than expected, it might be worth paying closer attention now rather than later. Most people won't notice this until it's too late, but now you know what to look for. And more importantly, you know why it happens. If you're running an EcoBoost engine, I'm curious, what's your oil change routine like, and have you noticed any of these signs? Drop it in the comments. And if this made you rethink how you maintain your car, pass it along to someone else who might be driving one of these without realizing what's going on. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this, because there are a lot of these small details that can make a big difference over time.